Hello, welcome back to Jeff's Cave of Cool Books. And I want to continue with another shelf tour. It's going to have some caveats attached, though. I want to talk about my fantasy and sword and sorcery collection. Now, I'm going to mention what I have here, mostly. And I'm going to talk about some books that I own, but that are in storage back in the United States. But I will mention them as important part of my fantasy book collection, although you would say maybe if they were that important you would have them there with you. But I do live in Japan. It does take a lot of money and time to bring all that stuff over, but trust me, next time I go home I'll be bringing a lot of these books that I mentioned later that are back there in the United States and Washington State. I'll be bringing them back with me or sending boxes back home. It's going to cost a bit, but I'm getting tired of having my collection separated. I would like to have my collection reunited at some point. So, the caveats. I'm not today going to talk about my Manly Wade Wellman books. Those are going to be, I have some paperbacks and then also these beautiful hardbacks here. This one doesn't count. This is Donald Wandry that I talked about in a couple of videos ago, but these I'm going to leave for another special focus video on Mr. Wellman, who deserves his own video. And I'm also going to talk about my Robert E. Howard books, most of which are sword and sorcery, although quite a few are just straight adventure and historical adventure collections of stories, since Howard mostly wrote stories. I'm going to do a separate video about Robert E. Howard because he deserves his own video too. Not to say that these other fantasy writers don't deserve videos to themselves. Many of them do, and many of them may indeed get one on my channel at some point. I'm going to start off with the granddaddy of them all, the Lord of the Rings 3-book cycle by JRR Tolkein. If there's a more famous fantasy series in the world, I don't know of it. This is a collection I got here in Japan. This is a HarperCollins collection. I have the 3 novels, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, all in separate, I believe, Ballantine editions. The ones that had the really interesting old art with the kind of beige covers. But I wanted to have, all of these. When I moved here to Japan, and previously to that, I was in South Korea, and that's when the Peter Jackson films were coming out, and I wanted to have a big, all-in-one volume of the stories here. And of course, all together with some pretty small print. I have, and wow, this book, these newer paperback pages sure fade fast. If you count the appendices and the indices, I guess, then what you're left in maps, etc., you're looking at well over 1,100 pages in this sucker here. So that's a real key work, and I don't think any fantasy fan, let alone any, book fan, frankly, should have a library without that tome in there. And of course, couldn't have only The Lord of the Rings without its precursor, the perhaps slightly more children-friendly but still wonderful for adults, The Hobbit. This version of The Hobbit, again, I believe I did buy this one also in Japan. You'll see the Japanese sticker in the back there. Probably bought that at Kinokuniya or one of the big bookstore chains here. I have another version, the version with the Darrell K. Sweet cover with the giant eagle on it. If those of you who might know that version back at home, but had to have a version here with me. Great book as well. So that's the most key entry in high fantasy I think that you could possibly have. And another series that I've started collecting and started reading several years back, also while I was here in Japan, but haven't kept up with because it's just massive. It's one of those massive, colossal fantasy series that populates the fantasy bookshelves in new bookstores these days. although this is one of the good ones, I think. What I've read so far is quite impressive. But I just can't keep up with all of it. And now it seems like it's at 27 volumes and spanning off with different trilogies and different cycles and different sequences. I do have the Malazan Book of the Fallen series, at least several of them, by Steven Erickson. Now the first one, Gardens of the Moon. Again, pretty typical fantasy cover. It just clocks in at a mere 666 pages. You know, Erickson was just getting started. I guess he was ready to kick into proper, massive fantasy novel gear with his sequels. So then I have Deadhouse Gates #3, and that one's pretty cool. I think this is pretty much the standard mass market paperback edition. And as you can see, it's already thicker than the first book. Now we're up to, with the glossary and appendices, at 843 pages. And then I have the third one, Memories of Ice. Okay. So kind of cool wraparound jacket there. And these are all Tor fantasy ones. And as you can see, it's even getting thicker. We're up to now with the glossary 925 pages, so it's getting more and more unwieldy. And then I stopped collecting the series, but I might have mentioned, if some of you few viewers who watched some of my earlier videos on this channel might recall, I talked about sometimes picking up a few books from my university kind of teacher's lounge area where someone reads a book and then leaves it, and anyone who wants it can pick it up. And that's how I got a hold of the 10th novel in this massive cycle of the book, Malazan Book of the Fallen, and that's Toll the Hounds, with a pretty cool looking, nasty, you know, werehound or some kind of hound-like creature there. And again, we got wraparound jacket of sorts. And now they're, you know, by this point, they're just ridiculously large. This is 1,295 pages, chonker. I have kept these. I had a lot of the Song of Ice and Fire novels by George R.R. Martin. I read a couple of those, and then I just basically gave them away to some friends. You know, especially with the way things are going with that series, and probably not going to be finished. And I saw the TV series completing the story, just lost kind of impetus for anything of that, so gave that away. But the Steven Erickson series is interesting. If I ever do get back into that cycle, I'll collect some more and maybe finish up the first 10, since I have the 10th one. Who knows if I'll ever get to those, though. Okay, let's talk about, while we're in the more modern realm, because we're going to get back into my more comfort zone-y older books in a moment. But another thing I picked up here in Japan was the Best of Fantasy 2004. Interesting collection here. We got some pretty impressive writers. We've got some stories by Neil Gaiman, who is persona non grata now, of course, I guess. Michael Swanwick, Elizabeth A. Lynn, Peter S. Beagle, Robert Silverberg, Gene Wolfe, Tim Powers, Kelly Link, Deborah Rogi, Jeffrey Ford, and Jay Lake. So some cool stories in there. I've read a couple in the past, but I've probably forgotten them by now. I might have shown this one before in my science fiction, vintage science fiction collection, but I can't quite pinpoint where it should be put, because this has witchcraft and were creatures and things, and this is Darker Than You Think by Jack Williamson. Sadly, a little beaten up on the side, but this is a pretty cool looking book. And cover art by Rowena Morel. You see the transformation from this guy into a were-cat, it looks like. And then another person who's more familiar to science fiction readers, and that's Edmund Hamilton, The Valley of Creation. And this appears to be a kind of Burroughsian sort of fantasy. I don't know if I covered this in the Edgar Rice Burroughs and His Imitators video I did way back a couple months ago, but if not, that's one there. Sprgue de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, The Complete Enchanter. And this is a Valentine Del Rey book, The Magical Misadventures of Harold Shea. And there are 3 books, basically short novels, that this comprises, and that's The Roaring Trumpet, The Mathematics of Magic, and The Castle of Iron. It's a pretty heavy one, and it's got 415 pages. It includes an afterword by Sprgue de Camp, who of course also Fletcher Pratt worked on that afterwards as well. I think they wrote these stories probably for magazines, and they compiled them into a novel, or a collection of novels. And then I have some, I mentioned these briefly before in a video, but I have some Clifford D. Simak, another science fiction writer, primarily known for his science fiction, but he also wrote fantasy tolerably well. These are pretty good, especially the last one I'll show you. We have Enchanted Pilgrimage with a really nice, typically cool Darrell K. Sweet cover. And this is also a Valentine Del Rey book, or just a Del Rey at this stage. No, it says Valentine and Del Rey. So I'm not sure what the relationship between those 2 publishing houses were. Maybe Valentine bought out Del Rey, or vice versa. We have another one from the same company, The Fellowship of the Talisman. Not quite as cool a cover on this one. And these are all kind of quest stories with various goblins and ghouls and beasties and ghosts and dragons. And the best of these, I think, is Where Evil Dwells. And that one has a very cool cover there, I think. Who does that cover? It looks like Michael Whalen. That's what I was going to say. Looks like Michael Whalen. And it is. Pretty cool cover there. This is the first paperback edition, and I remember picking this up years and years ago when it first came out in 1982. So it's over 40 years old, this paperback. It's in pretty good shape still. Now, this is a series I only have the first one of, and that's Stephen R. Donaldson's Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever series, starting with Lord Fowl's Bane. Now, fantasy readers are likely aware of the reputation of this main character, Thomas Covenant, who suffers from leprosy and somehow ends up in this magical kingdom and does something pretty horrific and heinous in the beginning of the book, kind of thinking he's in the dream state and not in reality, and the repercussions that has afterwards leaves a, no pun intended, rather foul taste in the mouth. But I'm really fascinated by this series. I keep being drawn back to it and toying around it and circling around it. I'm going to finish the first trilogy at least one of these days. And this is another Valentine Del Rey collection. I love these really heavy kind of, solid feeling paperbacks that are really fun to read with good print. This one even has a bookmark from where I think I picked it up, BookQuest in Olympia, Washington. So I'm guessing that's where I got it, or at least some other books, and I have this used bookmark in there from that same trip several years ago back to the States. Anyway, I will get the other 2. Again, they have impressive, I believe, Darrell K. Sweet covers. See if I can verify that. Yep, Darrell K. Sweet. You can take a good look at that one. A little more, a little less close-up face character work. Like often he has kind of interesting little tableau. They're not really action scenes so much as just characters kind of looking at each other. But this one has got some action going on. Looks like it's kind of a little different compared to a lot of Sweet's work. He does memorable cover art for all, at least I believe all of the first 2 cycles anyway. There might be a 3rd cycle of this. Anyhow, interesting series. I'm going to get through that one of these days. I have another, somehow I got a whole pile of these Valentine Del Reys. This one is from a famous, well, I shouldn't say famous, but respected pulp writer, E. Hoffman Price. Now, he wrote a lot of Oriental adventures and a lot for the pulps. And like a lot of these pulp guys, Hubie Cave and several others I can't think of off the top of my head. Manly Wade Wellman, of course, came back and put out a whole bunch of Silver John novels and John Funston novels and etc. later in his career. And E. Hoffman Price did the same with this one, I believe, The Devil Wives of Li Fong. This was written in 1979, so long past his pulp heyday. This one looks quite interesting. I haven't read this one yet either. It's kind of a Chinese set adventure, I believe. The cover's by Rowena Morel again, who I showed at the beginning there. Story here is kind of old China, ancient China story, and Li Fong ends up with two wives who are, you know, I guess kind of cursed to be in demon form, and they're humans, but they are actually perhaps demons. Anyway, they aren't evil though. They seem to like Li Fong and try to help him in this quest. Anyway, it looks pretty interesting. I'm glad I picked that one up sometime in the past. We have a couple of club stories. I also have a collection of Jorkin's, Lord Dunsany's Jorkin's Tales, which is a group of mini stories. There were several Jorkin's volumes that Lord Dunsany or Lord Dunsany wrote about a guy in a typical British gentleman's club who tells some tall tales. Arthur C. Clarke did his own version of those in Tales from the White Hart. I guess in this one there might not be just one person. Several people might tell tales. I haven't read these yet, but I've had this collection for quite some time. And in the same vein, but I've read these. These are fantastic. This is one of Canadian writer Sterling Lanier's sadly few books, The Peculiar Exploits of Brigadier Fellows. And there's another collection that he wrote, which is much, much harder to find. But these stories are just fantastic. And this is a fairly rare, hard to find volume, published by, who did publish this? Walker and Company in New York. And Brigadier Fellows is kind of a, you know, he's not pompous. He's just a quiet British gentleman who comes to the club, and there's usually a obnoxious boor of a fellow in the club who challenges fellows to tell some kind of story, and then the narrator is just another member of this club, and Brigadier Fellows relates these crazy and highly original stories. Quite often they involve all sorts of monsters, beasties, weird supernatural happenings, just fantastic stuff. This is highly recommended if you can get your hands on these. Sterling Lanier also, of course, wrote the Hero's Journey and Unforsaken Hero books, and Menace Under Marswood, and with the other Brigadier Fellows story. Those are the only 5 books that he ever put out. So doing some research for an upcoming buddy read with Steve at Heroic Book Adventures and Sam at Captain Samuel's Sigils for a buddy read of Hero's Journey, the first in that series, short, sadly curtailed series. Doing some research about Lanier, apparently he suffered a car accident that caused some brain damage and headaches that kept him from being able to write for any length of time, and then he also eventually had a stroke, which further incapacitated him. So that's why we never saw a third and final Hero book, unfortunately. Although there'll be more news about that, an interesting news item, which I will share in that upcoming buddy read video, which I'm planning to have sometime early next month with those two great fellow booktubers. Okay, let's see, what else besides that I have? I have a lot of Lin Carter, not all of it here. Of course, people have a love-hate relationship with his work. Certainly not happy with what he partook of, along with L. Sprague de Camp and some others, in kind of doing a hatchet job on Robert E. Howard's original Conan stories. And Carter himself was a fun writer, but I wouldn't say he was original writer particularly. But when he liked something, he tried to do his own version of it. So he did plenty of Burroughs pastiches. He did Conan pastiches. He did Doc Savage pastiches. And he also what he was really good at was as an editor, and he brought to light a lot in the 70s, a lot of classic fantasy authors predating Tolkien, and like E.R. Edison and Lord Dunsany and Thomas Burnett Swan and a lot of these people. And he wrote his own little cycle of fantasy books. This is the first one and the only one that I particularly like. I have the sequel Dragon Rouge too, but Kesric, an adult fantasy. This is very fun, although, full of so many footnotes and references that he's tying it into other mythological and fantasy themes. But Kesric is a hero on a quest, and there's a beautiful maiden, and there's a bad wizard and a good wizard, and anyway, it's pretty fun. Again, we're talking Lin Carter here, so we're not talking supremely original by any stretch, but he mixes up some different elements in a pretty fun way, and that's, to my mind, one of his better and more readable books these days. Wow, this one's running long, folks. So to spare you from watching for forever and a day, I'm going to break this fantasy bookshelf tour, fantasy and sword and sorcery bookshelf tour, in 2 parts. So this will end the first part. So I'll see you in the next video with the rest of my fantasy books. Thank you for watching.